So I will start us off with the first question, and that question is going to be about language. Because we've noticed a particular care and attention to pay to language in many areas of your work, from campaigning for mycologically inclusive language to utilizing turns of phrase such as coinciding when finding a species. So I find that very interesting. Another example is the caution around using terms like fungal pathogens, and talking about queendoms instead of kingdoms. And of course, you also work within and between Spanish and English. So I wanted to ask you if you can tell us more about the place and meaning of language in your work.
Oh, that's such a good question. Oh, language creates reality, and we're living in an era in which diversity, equity, and inclusion is in the spotlight when talking about humans. And for me, there's no big difference between humans and non-human beings, and so I take inclusive language and diversity, equity, and inclusion as seriously for humans as for non-humans. So I campaign and I work for biological DEI. I do not use the term kingdom. I prefer kindom without the G. And if we are going to use kingdom, then why not queendom? And in this scenario of language creating reality, and working for a kingdom of life that has been traditionally neglected, the first step to educating myself and people in general was to find the correct phrasing around working for the fungi and working with them. And all that together with being brought up in 5 languages and having a feminist mother. So yeah, language is very important in my house and in my life. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Giuliana. So that's really interesting context there. So we're really interested in the Fungi Foundation and its work, particularly on cataloguing ancestral uses of fungi around the world. So maybe as a way of kind of introducing the Fungi Foundation and that work, could you tell us about it and some of its significance? And really, we've been really interested in the kind of ethical frameworks that you've been setting up within the foundation, and also the place of spirituality in that work, and also the attention to oral histories and stories as part of that work.
Oh, okay, so the Fungi Foundation is now, for the past 2 or 3 years, has been working focused on 4 programs, programmatic areas. Expeditions, where we go and visit places where nobody's ever been before to document or to coincide with fungal diversity there, or the funga that is found there. Funga, a term that was delimited by colleagues and myself to refer to fungal diversity of a given place. Another program is the education program, where we believe that as much should be taught about fungi in schools as is taught about plants and animals, at least. The conservation program, which is quite heavy in the policy side, and then the elders program, which is this is a beautiful programmatic area where we've taken on the task to unveil ancestral and traditional relationships between humanity and fungi. And those relationships are mostly known through edible courtship and, relationships between fungi and humans. And we don't really go there that much. We don't talk about edibility. So many people are focused on that. But then we do focus a lot on medicinal uses or relationships, ceremonial relationships between humanity and fungi, and then some more material relationships, which might have to do with weaving, dyeing, making, clothes, etc. And we really, all this happened when the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, had just struck, our world, and a lot of people started, really diving deep into the notion of nature-based solutions and looking, to biotechnology as a way forward. But that biotechnology was being framed as something that had to be created or that hadn't yet been created. And when you work for fungi and you've been in a relationship with them for as long as I have, you realize that, we have culturally co-evolved with fungi for millennia, and that cultural co-evolution holds relationships and kinships that are the key to all those problems that were being talked about at that time and space, and still actually quite a bit on these nature-based solutions. So it wasn't dear Stella McCartney who invented mycelium leathers, and I commend her for all her incredible work, but this was developed by people hundreds of years ago in Eastern Europe. And it wasn't it wasn't the use of lichens and fungi to make tweed that was the first time that we used fungi to dye wool. This has been used for millennia in different parts of the world, and we took on that task of unveiling that. But in that process of compiling and collating data that was published in peer-reviewed manuscripts, in general publications, and through oral history, we realized that there was a heavy threat of disseminating information that had been collected in the first place without consent. The fact that something's published in a peer-reviewed journal doesn't mean that the holders of that knowledge, traditionally, or indigenous knowledge, gave consent for that to be published. And so it was a really, really heavy learning process for the whole team at the Fungi Foundation to understand that in that process of unveiling, we could be accomplices to furthering a practice that we don't think is either legal or appropriate. So we developed ethical guidelines. Now, these are the first ethnomycological ethical guidelines. We did it without consulting indigenous peoples, and that's why we're also very cautious about talking about them. This was internal, with a group of ethnobotanists, such as our board member, Nancy Turner, who's a very well-renowned ethnobotanist and an elder in different communities in northern North America. And realized that we had the threat of doing what had been done, for example, to the Quechua people with quinoa, where they can't afford quinoa anymore, or what happened in Huautla de Jimenez when the practice of using psilocybe was shown to the world, and the town and villages were forever changed. We decided we would never go down that route. So at the moment, what we have is a wonderful catalogue of unveiling these relationships, ethical guidelines developed internally, and the certainty that we can't publish that because most of it, older documented knowledge was not documented with consent. So it's
that's fascinating. Yeah, fascinating, tricky. I wonder if are there any stories though of the fungi, of the use of the fungi that you've unveiled that you can share with us?
Yes, there are many. So there are some that were documented hundreds of years ago. There are others that have seemed to have disappeared, and there are others that are still used all around the world. For example, you can travel, and this is documented in different parts of the world, but for example in Chile, puffballs and the spores of puffballs that are used to heal wounds in animals and in humans. Now you see that. So if you're in southern Chile and you find a shepherd in the mountains, he'll be carrying a bag filled with puffball spores in case his animals have a wound, and he needs to heal it. And you see that in many, many places of the world. A cultural coevolution of humans with puffballs, and not only for healing wounds, but also for protecting skin, for making fire. you know, the base of puffballs were used by peoples in Tierra del Fuego as tinder. So not only conchs used it as a tinder fungus, but also giant puffballs, and they're just fascinating. They're just the most incredible group of, you know, fungi. For me, they're just astonishing. And there was another part to your question. I'm trying to remember it, and I'm sorry.
Well, it was about the ethical framework and the place of spirituality, but I think
The
you
place
kind
of
of,
spirituality thing,
yeah,
yeah. And so the place of spirituality is extremely important. People tend to overlook the intimate relationship between humanity and fungi in ceremonial uses, and it's funny that, you know, people will be denying that or paganizing that use while they're having a beer or while they're having, you know, some wine, and maybe, you know, at Sunday lunch after they've just come back from, you know, taking communion with bread and wine, which are all based on fungi. So, you know, there's just this very, you know, shocking ignorance in different cultures that the vehicles to you know, attend, you know, the macrocosmos from the microcosmos, or you know, the celestial from the terrestrial, in most cultures is through the use of fungi, whether you know it or not, or whether you like it or not.
such a good point. Thank you. Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah.
That's so amazing. Thank you so much, just for sharing everything that you're sharing. It's just so exciting to hear. I wanted to ask, thinking about the comments on the pandemic. You know, I was listening to Vandana Shiva talk during the pandemic, and she was mentioning how there's a connection between, say, like the systematic killing of healers, you know, with witch hunts, etc., and with the fact that we have pandemics nowadays, you know. So there's been sort of like a disconnection on the basis of very violent forces. You know, I'm very aware of the histories of extraction that all of our territories, you know, share, even though they're different. You know, say in certain spaces there's settler colonialism, in others it's just been kind of like basic extraction. And going back to what you were talking about with like the ethical frameworks, I mean, this is really important for me as a Mexican researcher, you know, an artist, because I take this to heart, you know, and it's really hard to navigate these things when we're, you know, mestizo, or, you know, like a white, there's whitenings and all sorts of complexities to our identities, right? But specifically with regard to those histories of extraction, I was wondering, with regard to the archive that you're building and you have built for Maria Sabina, which is something that I'm really deeply thanking you for, you know, from a personal standpoint, because I'm working with Ñañú communities more in the central parts of Mexico, in Amialco, for example. Those are different ways of relating with fungi, you know. But with regards to the healing aspect, you know, like someone like Maria Sabina, who's like this renowned healer whose knowledge was completely extracted, you know, and thinking about those legacies, the importance and the fact that they're getting lost, you know. So maybe I wanted to ask you a little bit about that experience, opening the archive and you know, like getting to know the people and just coming to Mexico and getting acquainted with the fungal worlds over there. If you could share a little bit about that, that would be fascinating.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, I just, before I dive into that, I just wanted to mention, you know, just an anecdote about what you were saying about being maybe a mestizo, mestiza, or, you know, how we navigate working with indigenous knowledge when one isn't indigenous or doesn't feel indigenous, you know, etc. So I when I opened the foundation in the US, Paul Stamets and I invited a Peruvian Australian actress called Nat Kelly to be on the board, and I met Nat on you know, just a Zoom meeting, and we were talking about our heritage, and you know, she was telling me she was from a Quichua family, etc., and asked about my you know, history, and I mentioned, you know, my father was Italian, and my grandparents from Calabria, you know, they didn't know how to read or write, and they were just contadini, so subsistence farmers. And she said, "Oh, so you're indigenous Italian?" I was like, wait, is that possible? It was just a shift in my head. I'd never really thought about it. My grandparents just literally only spoke dialect, and then with time, that kept in my head, and I did the famous genetics test, and it came out, close to 55% Italian from that spot in Italy. It's just like heavily indigenously, Calabrian, or coming from Greek, the Greek, and there's Northern Africa influence on it, but very heavily pinpointed. And I suppose, and all that thinking, yeah, I'm indigenously Southern Italian. And so where do we draw those lines, and how do we think about it? And is indigenous only a term that's used for non-European content, places, or not? And I think that's really interesting to think about. It's just a parenthesis there. I still haven't resolved it completely, but every aspect of what you would say is an indigenous people applies perfectly to my family in southern Italy, but nobody would say that anybody in Italy is indigenous, right? Just thinking about these things and how we place them, and whether we feel we have or not a right because we are mixed. I think it's interesting to think about that. And with Mexico, it was completely a calling. So I visited Mexico. I visited Oaxaca in 2013, I think it was, or 14, around there. I was very burnt out, and I went on a solo trip, and I just wanted to go on a pilgrimage and just lay a flower at Maria Sabina's grave. Nothing more, nothing less. Just, spent less than 24 hours in Huautla, actually. Just got a bus up the Sierra. And in that passage through Huautla, a member of her family received me and said, we were expecting you. And he came to the door and he said, you the mushroom woman coming from the south? I was like, no, I'm Giuliana. I'm here to lay a flower, and I'm bringing these gifts. He said, but are you the mushroom woman who's coming from the south? I was like, well, I work for mushrooms. I'm coming from the southern hemisphere. I don't know. I'm just here. And then he said, we've been expecting you, and invited me into what was Maria Sabina's house. And there was, a short dialogue there, and a request for help, and the acknowledgement that there was in ceremony, they knew that I was coming, and all that was very unexpected, and it didn't really change my plans at that moment. And I left them some gifts I'd taken, and I went to the cemetery, and I laid some flowers and spent some time at Maria Sabina's grave, and then I left. And 7 or 8 years later, I got a message from Huautla with this knowledge of, we were told that you were the mushroom woman who came from the south, and we need help. We have an archive that is being, it's going moldy, it's being eaten by termites. It was just, everything was being decomposed. And that request for help just really hit me, and I was like, yeah, and it all made sense, why I'd gone to Huautla for, I don't know, 18 hours or something, and had that encounter. And it's with Inti Garcia Flores, who is the guardian of the archive. His father, Renato Garcia Dorantes, was the archivist. He was a photographer and videographer of the town of Huautla, and built an archive over 4 decades. And his son, Inti, is the guardian of that archive, and the person who requested for me just companionship and help to be able to save that. And it's been a couple of years of just the most beautiful symbiosis, where we've been cleaning everything that's there. We've built a new facility. We've been able to, in my case, just really assist him in sort of raising the funds and planning out what to do for that knowledge to not be lost, and for the Mazatec people to be able to decide, or at least a Mazatec family to be able to decide what to do with what their family member, compiled. but it's not deliberate. It wasn't sought after. It's actually not very public at all, and it's been years of work. It's just a calling. It's a beautiful calling.
That's so beautiful. Thank you so much. Like, just for, I don't know, listening to the calling. You know, sometimes we all talk about how we don't get to choose whether we work with fungi. They kind of like bring us in, you know, and then all of a sudden life makes sense so differently, you know. And I agree with what you're saying. Thank you for this reflection. This conference, just for a little bit of context, is about us having a dialogue, because in academia usually, you know, you talk at people. So in this case, we're just like opening up our processes, our hearts, being like, these are the problems that we're dealing with, but this is the type of work that we know that we need to do. It's collaborative, you know, in that sense, you know, like sometimes we need to think beyond identity in that sense, you know, like you think about like the partnerships between, like, I don't know, like a rhizome and a fungus, and it's just like, where there had to be consent of some sort, even though that those were radical differences, you know, and that's beyond the human. So for me, it's just like, it really serves. And then thinking about like critiques by indigenous scholars saying, actually, the term indigenous is a modernizing aspect, you know, that abjects people, you know, because you don't feel indigenous. It's a term that's imposed on us. So like really talking about those things, I think it's important, you know, if we are to collaborate, because it's not like anybody can just get out of a situation of precarity on their own when we're facing these types of structures, you know. So in that sense, again, really thank you for that, because I mean, at least the communities that I'm working with, I mean, we all know that we need each other. It's not just can you please come just like on Saturdays? It's like, no, we need to like build a foundation, and this is exactly what you've done, you know, with yours. So it is an inspiration.
It's the long vision, long term. It's a lot of, we're in a world where just the immediacy of everything is overwhelming, you know. News lasts maybe an hour at most, and there's just this ability to be distracted constantly. And I think, you know, the key to any you know, long-term commitment is concentration and, you know, discipline, and, you know, facing things. Just, you can't just swipe over things, you know, or swipe up or swipe down or swipe one way or swipe the other. It's giving attention, dedication, and giving a lot of time to one thing. That if something takes a long time, doesn't mean that there's something wrong with it, you know. Doesn't mean that it's not modern. Something like that. Yeah.
Thank you. Just to develop on this question, or this thing what you were just saying about indigeneity and maybe purity of categories, you know, what we inherited especially from Western Enlightenment and white heteropatriarchy, you know, carries that on to make us think about pure categories, which are usually put into opposition. It seems that fungi completely, you know, destroy that, right? So there's this kind of all these things we think are in opposition and separate, like life and death, beginning and end, presence and absence, the notion of the individual, right? The identity, what Xalli, you were saying, right? Or existing in general, are becoming really complicated, and it really changed the terms of conversation, I think, thinking with fungi. There's another aspect to it as well, where I think fungi make us think differently about how we think the relationship between the planetary and the site-specific. There's something happening around that as well. And I was just wondering if you are reflecting on these pressures and dynamics, and whether those inform your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, you know, I'm really happy that the mass sort of collective level of knowledge is moving forward, and we can now start talking about the complexities of fungi, because a lot of people think it's all, you know, first of all, people think fungi are one thing, and fungi are a whole group of organisms as diverse or even more diverse than plants and animals. You have unicellular fungi that reproduce through budding. You have multicellular fungi that reproduce, you know, genetic recombination, you know, sex, you know, whatever, and so many thousands of types of ways you can reproduce and live. And these are very, very profound topics of conversation among, you know, groups of friends and colleagues. I was with just very recently with a dear friend and colleague, Merlin Sheldrake, in the field, and we were just, you know, mentioning that there's so many ways to be a fungus, you know. So it's, you know, being a fungus isn't just one way, and that's important. It's important to acknowledge the complexities of fungal life are way more than we can imagine. It's not all positive collaboration, positive in terms of human ethics. I don't even know if that's the right way to say it, but it's not all about, oh, we're all going to be better and it's all going to be smooth and it's all for humans to be really well. And all that is I don't know how to say it without swearing, but it's all bullshit, really. Because what happens ultimately is that nothing is, you know, unilaterally, just binomially related. There's always so much more complexity, and so much variation in that complexity when you're talking about a kingdom of life. So, you know, nobody would really dare talk about animals in the same terms that they talk about fungi. And normally people will be asking you about, you know, something around insects or, you know, mammals. Whereas when you're talking about fungi, the question is generic to the whole kingdom of life. And we need to start breaking those barriers. It's actually at the center of what my entire work is, moving the bar. I don't know if fortunately or unfortunately had the task to start, you know, 25 years ago doing this. So I had to start with the really basic sort of 101, you know, they're not plants, they're not, you know, animals. And then we had to move on to create and delimit words. You know, it's been just this long haul of, you know, creating policy and creating sort of, but finally we're at a place where we can say, okay, now let's talk about what's happening in this one group or this other group, or in a mycorrhizal association where we see trade, we see competition, we see, you know, we see annihilation. There are battles in decomposing wood, you know, and finally we're at that point of being able to talk about the complexities. And thankfully there are people, you know, as, you know, eloquent and just incredible, like Merlin Sheldrake or Toby Kears, or, you know, so many other mycologists, David Hibbett, and so many others that can really put that forward and sort of lay those layers above, like the cement that I've had to lay through the foundation, so that people can just talk about it. Yeah.
That's so interesting. And I guess, so holding on to that complexity of fungi, I want to ask a question again about kind of methods and working, because so much of your work really seems, to me at least, to be involved in collaboration and openness, and it's got this like sense of plurality, and it holds multitudes. And within these kinds of collaborations that are transnational and trans species, they have, like, you're working in different temporalities, as you already mentioned, and there must be these different competing priorities and different modes of working and direction of travel that kind of don't neatly fit within one another. But with these connections there, I was just wondering how working with fungi and your knowledge of fungi and how they participate in the world impacts or informs how you work, how you understand your own ways of working, and how these connections to fungi operate, and what they teach you, basically. I'm kind of interested in.
Yeah, so for the first, you know, 15 or more years, they were, you know, it was just a very sort of parasitic relationship where I just had to feed off of them to be able to move forward, because nobody was really getting it, or very few people. It was just like a handful of us that were, and so it was very it was just them and I, you know, in a way, you know, and if you know, all there was, you know, Paul Stamets' books and maybe, you know, field guides in Europe and somewhere else, but there wasn't much going on. You know, you'd read, you know, Lynn Margulis and things like that about symbiosis, but it's all very contemporary there. with the development of interest from humans in fungi that aren't thought to just be around for humans, the possibility of growing together and of collaboration, of course, collaboration is a decision. It's a decision that is in my case really with fungal awareness and fungal knowledge and fungal discoveries at the center. Everything I do, so my life's work and there's no sort of before work or after work. It's all just a continuum where sleep seems, the hours you need to sleep seem to be a problem. Just like got to do it because otherwise you can't move forward. But there's no big division, and being a mother didn't really stop that either. But the fungal way of life, there are so many ways to be a fungus that you could find, if you need to find force in the fungi to be able to move forward with a mission, you can find it. In my case, I don't really need that anymore. I did at the beginning because there was a lot of, just everyone like, why don't you stop talking about them? I mean, nobody else is talking about them. What's wrong with you? And I was just so certain that this was something that important, and that was like on the limit of sanity. And so I would definitely draw fungal examples to say, penicillin and wine and whatever and bread and just all that. But it's just a big compenetration. I feel very compenetrated with all ways of fungal life. Very essentially, and very, very effortlessly. I don't need to very much tap into reasons.
Okay, Xalli, do you want to ask next question?
Yeah. If it's okay with you, I would like to maybe talk about the art part. I mean, I was just thinking, it's so exciting to talk about this topic in various ways, even from a disciplinary perspective, because it's like a blurring of the boundaries, right? Same with the individual, the collective, like what Lenka and Elspeth were saying in terms of the binaries, right? Which is something that we're still dealing with in so many ways, So I was just thinking, as for the collaborations that you facilitate through your foundation, I've noticed that, I mean, there is an artistic research part of it that's a whole multiverse. So I would like to maybe ask you about that. How do you feel about collaborating with artists? What does art, what type of role does it play, within your work or that type of pairing with the topic of fungi?
Oh, it's so important, from the very beginnings of the foundation's life, over 10 years ago, and of my work with anything mycological for a couple of decades. Art has been at the center, and we've been working in biennales and exhibitions all over the world for many, many years. There's something that isn't very clear as to why, and that's actually the beauty of it, I think. There's artists, each artist and each discipline has a way of seeing the world that's different from others. And I've actually been in encounters where I profoundly believe in those artists' vision and they believe in mine, and I might not understand what they're doing and they might not understand what I'm talking about, but we believe each other, and that's at the center of many of these collaborations. But I would say that where my personal interest lies heavily is in the for many years I've spent a lot of time in forests, and in the forest you get to think about different things, and it would always be in my mind that I would need to have a state of openness to an encounter and of receptiveness when I entered a forest. And it meant sort of slowing down and, being very aware of the notion that I might not find what I look for, but I will definitely see things and find things even if I'm not looking for them. And that's where I think the cross between art and science lies. So both artists and scientists need to be open to an encounter that may be different than your hypothesis. You might not, an artist may set out to, I use this example quite a bit, to paint a hand or to sculpt a hand and just be really focused on that hand. And you might encounter several hurdles and you might, and things will happen. And unless you're open to changing, that state of receptiveness, you might miss sculpting or painting the most beautiful starfish in the world. Because, you might set out to paint a hand or to sculpt a hand, but life may take you to create the most beautiful other form from that, from your sort of, just, I don't know the word in English, but you're set in doing one thing and you're not open to doing others and you miss out. And in the forest and in science, it's the same thing. You can set out with one purpose and you're just like, really, or I'm going to find a red mushroom, and your eyes are set on red and on a mushroom shape. And you're going to miss out, the most beautiful yellow, stinkhorn, because you're not open to that, to an encounter, and you're not receptive to where life takes you. So for me, that's always been where I personally live. I live in that space of just something. It's a fluidity of purpose in a forest. And so if I feel that I have to go right, but the GPS is saying go left, I'm going to go right. I mean, I might go back later, but I will definitely go right. So and that's where I think that also art and science have a good crossing. That's where we've been working, and it's in the unknown. It's in the following something that will take you. You don't know really what's going to come out. It's the same with science, with looking, searching for species.
Yeah, it sounds like a kind of like a sense of wonder and discovery and a magic you experience, right? Maybe which.
Right, but with the discipline as well. And so and people think that artists just aren't disciplined, and it's all very relaxed and loose, and it's not really like that. And I get a lot of the same, with the foundation, where most of my work is behind the desk doing stuff with tax and accountants, whatever. But you have to have that, and that discipline, and the materiality of how you work, and in giving value to the time of wonder, to wonder, and for that time to be given value. That for me is only taught through the arts, where improvisation and exploration, sensorial explorations, are desired and are built into the schedule of work. I think that should be like that in everything.
Yes, I have to say, I was with Lenka in the woods in the UK once, and she called out for a porcini and then one appeared. So that was, yeah.
I learned it from my grandmother, because this is how my grandmother in Czech Republic used to hunt. She would be calling them, like, come on.
I call them too. Yeah.
Summoning them.
I think it works. It definitely works.
It does.
Right? That's what, yeah.
Definitely. I call them all the time. I'll sing. I'll just,
Yeah.
call, and definitely there's something. I'm not sure if one counts all the times you call them they don't appear, but we definitely count the times we call them they do appear.
True. I'm going to now move us to another really fascinating and interesting topic, which we've been really obsessed with for the last couple of months, the question of rotting. and letting things rot. And I listened one podcast with you where you were talking about rotten mold, and you have a documentary in Fungi Foundation about rotting. So I was wondering whether you could tell us more about the role of rotting in ecology and ecosystems and what it means in that context, but also maybe in a more kind of like because when I think as a kind of feminist thinker about let's think rot, it makes me think about let's rot the oppressive systems of power, right? That it's kind of like a revolutionary potential of how we can maybe think about it also in relation to social issues and politics. So maybe if you want to tell
well, you know, I mean, we have to let everything rot. I think ideals and ideas have to rot. I mean, there's no possibility of composition without decomposition. There's no way that we can recycle anything without decomposition. And I mean, for me, it's really strange that people find it strange that rot is valued. And it's because we are taught that, and these are very heavily, these ideas are heavily tainted by religions, where there is a beginning with birth and there is an end with death. And that actually, if you look at nature, that doesn't exist at all. I mean, there's no beginning. I mean, you can fix a beginning at any part of a cycle. In a circle, where's the beginning, right? Where's the beginning in a circle? So if we're going to talk about cycles, then we need to eliminate starts and ends immediately from the language we use. We're looking at a linear process, then we can discuss if that's actually if that exists or if it doesn't. But I have been brought up in a household where the belief of changing systems is absolute. My mother was a refugee, a political prisoner, and I was born during her exile, and a woman who lost her freedom for just fighting oppression or notions of one way of things having to be taught, or having one way you have to exist. And so decomposition for me is fundamental. The only way we can move forward to recompose ourselves or recompose societies is through decomposing what we now know isn't a way forward. I don't know how much more to say that, but I used to believe that in what we were taught, that there was a finite amount of energy, and that transformation and recycling was the only way for X amount of something composed to then be the same X amount decomposed to then that same X amount to recompose. And I've learned over the years, reading different authors, that we're not so sure that the amount of energy is finite. And so my whole notion of decomposition is constantly evolving as I learn about, even laws of physics that have been contested. It's not that there's always a balanced amount. But what we do know is that the building blocks of life, material, I hate the word, but the building blocks of a tree trunk or of an animal through decomposition are liberated and left available to recompose in a different form. If that's not the beginning of life, then what is? That's the way I see it. I think rot, if you position yourself in rot as an initial kickstarter of a process, you actually sort of come to terms with ends of life forms in an easier way. I mean, I find it soothing to think that the end of my life form will give way to many other life forms, instead of thinking that the end of my life form is going to be the end of everything. So scary,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But there's also, you can see the challenge that rot, the kind of concept of rot or thinking about rot gives to culture. I think people,
Well, not really, because if you think about penicillin's the best example.
yeah,
You know, penicillin comes from a mold, Penicillium. It was first known to be used by rubbing moldy bread and moldy fruit onto wounds. You know, I mean, it wasn't a problem.
yeah,
I think, you know, a lot of the contemporary issues with mold. I mean, look at koji. Koji's a mold that's rotting. You know, we're eating it and we're paying fortunes for it. You know, we're eating cordyceps to boost our health, and it's, you know, decomposing an insect. What do you know? What there? I mean, I would contest that. I think that the notion of mold and decomposition being something negative and rot being something undesired comes from, so, you know, some religions that believe that, you know, light has to be present for something to be virtuous. Sunlight, direct sunlight, you know. I mean, there are some cultures and religions where people don't eat fungi because they believe that they grow in the absence of light, or, you know, that fungi were looked at as something undesired because they decomposed, and maybe there are some smells that aren't very nice and some textures and the attraction of, you know, insects and stuff like that. But way before that, we were healing with mold and we were eating with mold, and what we now call rot was the only way to sterilize, you know, and preserve foods. Like fundamental. Like, how do you cure meat? You put mold around it because they produce antibacterial. So, you know, the salami, and so there's a duality. There's a big duality that is sort of frustrating in a way. You know, you can be eating, you know, have a koji burger and eat a lovely slice of salami and be at the same time be talking about how bad rot is, but all of that's thanks to rot, you know.
yeah, absolutely. So, do you think there are any limits to fungi? And so there's, you know, fungi are so popular now. And metaphors about fungi are traveling around and being used in all different ways, and thinking about fungi are being used in particular ways. But I know you've dedicated your life to working with fungi, but are there limits, or have you come up against limits? What do you think are the limits there?
Oh, there are definitely limits. I mean, in the sense that, you know, there's a fundamentalist, you know, way of looking at things, looking at life on Earth, and one can say, you know, in a mycocentric view, the limits are very clear, in the sense that fungi live inside their food, and they have a physical limit to where they can expand. So, you know, without plants and without animals and others, there would, you know, the symbiosis is two-way. You know, fungi wouldn't be. So it's not that fungi are at the service of plants, or that plants are at the sole service of fungi, but there's a mutualistic, in many cases, relationship. So I think the fundamentalist view has been necessary. It still is necessary. I'm very radical in that, and I live it, but I understand that mycorrhizal fungi don't live without the plant. They just can't. It's an exchange. But at the same time, I do contest that we think about fungi assisting the life of plants, you know, that mycorrhizae exist for the plant. You know, for me, a tree is nothing but a photosynthetic symbiont of a fungus, and it's equally valid, right? So plants are just a photosynthetic symbiont of the fungus, where you place yourself in the relationship, you can see it in a different way. But the limit is very clear. It's a relationship that doesn't exist without both of them.
That's incredible. Also thinking about, for example, what we call shadow work, you know, in terms of all the things, you know, everything that happens behind the scenes, like you doing taxes, you know, but that is literally the work that needs to be done. That's not as pretty to show in like spectacles or whatever, but at least for me, you know, like this, like shadow, even in a Jungian or whatever kind of way, you know, thinking about all that labor that happens. I mean, for me, fungi are like not even a metaphor, right? Like they're an actual example of how life is able to happen. And the fact that we don't even give credit to any of that is insane. So
Yeah.
to
Oh,
think
but we've
about
come a
everything that
long way. We've come a long way. It's really interesting to be alive and to see what's happened. I can't believe, I mean, I did think that it would happen in my lifetime. I mean, I worked for it to happen in my lifetime. You're never really sure, but just the way it's happening, it's just joyful to watch. Yeah, it's really, really cool to see people, and also just to feel that you don't have to do it all anymore. It's so good. You know, like there are other people that can talk and will advocate, and you know, we'll have fungal interest. It's wonderful. Yeah. Beautiful.
That's so amazing.
Yeah, finally.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just have a last question, but I think you've already answered it throughout the conversation, but maybe you would want to add something to it. It seems that your work is really engaged in what we would call something feminism, decolonial, anti-racist, and politics and ethics and interspecies ethics. What are these? And you already mentioned it in how your life is influenced by that as well. But if you maybe could develop on that, how your life and work is engaged in those issues, or if you think about them, or if you think about these things in Fungi Foundation.
We definitely do at the foundation, but I think I have to sort of rewind in you know, my lineage. So my mother's mother, my grandmother, was a professor of physics and mathematics when no female was a professor of mathematics and physics. Now my mother is a really like heavy activist in many things. She's politically active, you know, she's always been a feminist. And so these aren't stances or lookouts on life that I have had to reach by myself. I am a product of many women, not men. The men in my family aren't feminist, haven't been feminist. But the women, especially from my mother's side, were very, very heavily embodied, you know, and empowered, and in radical ways for their times. So I am a continuation of that outlook on life, and so that's effortless. In the foundation, it's forefront, and it's forefront in the non-acceptance of anything different, and it's forefront in the non-acceptance of critical thought, and in the total acceptance of differences between people in the team and views, and how desired differences are. And so, yeah, the also being product of a dictatorship, anything dictatorial is just not welcome. So there's a lot of plurality and space for people in our team to bring forward ideas, to work in different ways. And yeah, they, you know, I'm very proud that that in my team they call me the anti-boss, because I'm not gonna patrol anyone. I'm not, you know. It's funny, we had a meeting just a few months ago with the team, and they were asking for evaluations. I was like, I'm not gonna evaluate you. I mean, who am I to evaluate you? You know, because like, what are we talking about? I can tell you you've done a good job, but you know, the only person who can really evaluate you is yourself. You know, it's just like I'm constantly just facing these things, and I'm sort of hitting the wall of this conventional way of, you know, one being above another. I just don't really accept that. I wasn't brought up like that at all. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah. No, and I think, and also, you know, just another way that I've seen that it's totally embedded in myself is, you know, I have a son, and you know, he has interests totally different to mine. You know, he loves animals, and he actually loves living with animals and caged animals. I cannot tolerate caged animals, but he doesn't live with me. We live together. And that has been really important. And I've, you know, since he was very little, and that's been his passion, I've realized that I cannot impose on another human, you know, even my son, he's not living with me. We live together. Even if he's a baby, if he's a 1-year-old, 2, 3, 4, however, we live together. His interests are as important as mine. My interests are in no way better than his. You know, how I like to live doesn't mean that he has to live that way. So, you know, I really try in every aspect of life to put that forward. And yeah, so I have lived with caged animals before. It's not easy, but less and less. So I'm very happy now. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Giuliana. I think we're kind of coming up to our time. Thank you so much. It has been so interesting to hear your thoughts and hear more about the Fungi Foundation and your work. Really fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. I've enjoyed it so much. Thank you.
Can I just say one last thing, because this is just magnificent. Thank you so much for lending your time. We know you're busy everywhere, but just I think it's really, really important what you're saying, you know, like it's inspired so much. Ooh, now we're getting post-human situations here, but actually thinking about the coexistence, not in terms of a first person, like going into the forest. We went with a group of students a couple of days ago to plant baby trees, and like the arts part of it is just thinking just that, you know, I hadn't really thought about it until you just said it, but it's like we're living among, you know, to try to decenter the human in terms of ego, right? Like these structures of oppression are just magnifications of me being like, no, I want to find the red mushroom, you know, and not really paying attention to the open hole, right? That is life. So that's just beautiful. Like, thank you so much for just putting it in those words. Like the invitation to rot, I think, is so fundamental, and it even sounds inviting.